Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, my name is Angel, and today we're going to be doing some pretty and useful DIYs. I've really been wanting to make a chessboard for a while now, and I actually came across this one on eBay, and it is antique, old, hand-painted, and perfect. So I wanted to try to dupe this one. And to start this project, I just grabbed an old cutting board from the thrift store, and I'm gonna start by measuring out this cutting board and figuring out how to make the board. So I had to do a little bit of math for this because the board is longer than it is wide, and a typical chessboard is 64 squares. So once I figured out the measurements, then I just used a ruler and a pencil to start marking out my lines horizontally and vertically. Now at this point, or actually even before this, I honestly should have gone ahead and stained this board. I knew I wanted it darker. I was just so excited to start painting the squares that I completely skipped that part until later. So I will get back to that in just a little bit, but as you can see here, I'm just taking a small paintbrush and some Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster, and I am hand painting all of my squares. Now for this color, I did end up doing 2 coats, and as you can see, I'm doing it pretty quickly. I'm not really concerned at all about making these perfect because I want it to look a little messy, if that makes sense, and more like the inspiration and how every square was just not perfectly made. And as you can see here, I do go back in and stain my board. I'm just using some watered down paint that I mixed up to a color that I liked. Then of course, because I forgot this step, I did have to go back in and do the white squares at the edges again. I think now would be a great time for me to introduce you to the sponsor for today's video, BetterHelp. This year, I'm really trying to focus on my health, and that also includes my mental health. I know we are probably all really busy with hectic schedules, but BetterHelp makes it easy and convenient to connect with over 30,000 licensed therapists to find one that specializes in your unique needs. Signing up is really easy. Just visit betterhelp.com/Angel Nicole, answer a few questions, and you'll be matched with a licensed therapist in most cases within 48 hours. The best part about BetterHelp is it's incredibly flexible with how you choose to talk to your therapist. You can chat via phone, video, or messaging, whichever is most convenient for you. By clicking the link in the description box below, you'll get 10% off your first month with BetterHelp. You can start your journey today and discover your own unique ways to manage life's challenges and focus on your health. A big thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. Now let's get back to crafting. For the other squares, I'm actually just going to use 1 coat of my black chalk paint. And the reason I'm only doing 1 coat is I'm actually going to wipe some of this back off of the board later. And just like with the plaster color, I am just hand painting this. Again, not concerned about how messy it looks. Then once all the paint was dry, I'm just going to take some fine grit sandpaper and go over the entire thing, and you'll notice as I'm doing this, the sandpaper is actually bringing some of that black onto the plaster color. Then we're going to continue to age this even more. I'm adding some used coffee grounds on top of here and just spreading it all over this board and kind of tapping it into the board as I'm doing it. Then I'm going to spritz this with a little bit of water just to make sure all of those coffee grounds are nice and wet. I ended up letting this set for a couple hours before brushing off the coffee grounds, but it still was not aged enough for me. So I'm taking some antiquing wax and just kind of dry brushing the antiquing wax over this. And I also watered down a little bit of antiquing wax, and I'm going to go over all of this with that as well. And then I'll let this sit for a little while and just wipe it off with a paper towel. Then I'm going to go back in with the antiquing wax and just go over the black boxes. Again, I'm just going to let that sit for a little while, and then I'm going to take a wet rag and go over the entire thing. And as I'm doing this, because I only painted the one coat of that black chalk paint, some of the chalk paint is coming off as I'm doing this, and then it looks even more worn and you can see a little bit of the board underneath. For this project, we are going to be making a little sink tray, dish, whatever you want to call it. I am just going to be using some air dry clay for this, and my sink is actually pretty far back on my counter, so I don't have a lot of space in between the faucet and the wall. So I measured out exactly how big I wanted this. You could do the same if your sink and counter is like mine. So I warmed up my air dry clay in my hand, and then I'm going to use my rolling pin and just start rolling this out. I'm not going to make this super thick. I think I did it about 1/4 of an inch, but I am going to be adding side pieces to this little tray, so it doesn't have to be super thick, and also this way the air dry clay will dry out a little faster. Once I was happy with it, then I did want to add a little bit of a design to mine. I plan on painting this later, so I'm just using a floral stamp that I got from Amazon, and I'm going to lay that on top of my clay before I cut it down to size. Use my rolling pin over that stamp to leave the impression. Then I'll use my ruler and cut this down into a rectangular shape that is going to fit behind my sink. Then I'm going to take some more air dry clay, and like I said, I want to add a little rim around this tray. So I'm just going to roll out a thin long piece, and I ended up having to do 2 pieces. I didn't quite roll it out enough to make one long piece, but that's fine. You can totally put clay pieces together. So once I have my 2 pieces cut down, then I'm going to grab a little bowl of water, and I'm going to use that water all around the edges of the tray and on the inside of those 2 thin pieces to attach this to the tray. So I am using the water to kind of smooth out the rough edges on the clay, but also when you get clay wet, it acts as a glue to itself. So just get this nice and wet, and then you can attach those side pieces all the way around the tray. And I'm just using my fingers and making sure that they're staying wet and smoothing out these pieces up against each other. Make sure you're getting some water on the top and like right in between the 2 pieces so they will seal up. Don't worry if it's not perfect and you can't get all the edges smoothed out right now. You can always go over that with some fine grit sandpaper once this is dry, but do make sure if you have 2 pieces like I do that you are using the water to smooth those 2 pieces together. Once I was happy with it, then I set my tray aside and let it dry overnight for 24 hours. Once it was dry, I went in the next day and I did give it a light sanding, and then I am just going to go over it with 1 coat of my Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster. And the reason I did that really is so I could seal the clay, because I want to do some watercolors on here. I'm using this little watercolor pen that I found on Amazon. It's really neat. You just fill it up with water and then you can use your acrylic paints to turn into watercolors. And I'm just kind of using the stamp that I used on here as a reference for where I need to paint the flowers flowers, stems, and leaves. And as I'm doing this, I'm kind of letting each layer dry. I did the flowers first, and then I'm going in with a brown color and doing a few stems. Then I added in a bunch of greenery, and I'm not washing this little watercolor brush. I'm just kind of wiping it on a paper towel when I change colors. And then finally, I just kind of went back in and added a bunch of shadows and highlights and like the centerpieces of the flowers. Now to seal this, because it's going to be by a sink and obviously getting wet, I'm using some dishwasher safe Mod Podge, and I'm going to go in and do 3 coats of this on here. I don't think you actually need 3 coats, but I just wanted to make sure that it was going to be nice and waterproof. Now when you get your coats of this Mod Podge onto the air dry clay, don't be alarmed if your clay becomes movable again. Once this Mod Podge sets, your clay will harden once again. So you may need to give this an extra day or so to completely cure and dry so that it hardens up again. For this next project, I have some pots and pans that have the metal handles on them. So those can get pretty hot, and I thought maybe I could make some little handle koozies with a pot holder. Now, I found this pot holder at the thrift store. I thought it was really pretty. It's actually a lot larger, maybe the size of a hot pad over a pot holder, but you could use a Dollar Tree pot holder for this, or a pot holder you may already have that you're no longer using. But like I said, this one was actually much larger, so I was actually able to get 2 handle koozies out of this one hot pad or pot holder. Now, if you're using a regular pot holder or even the Dollar Tree ones, they're much smaller, and you won't have to do this part since you won't be cutting it in half. They're the perfect size to just make one. But since I cut mine in half, I wanted to make sure that center cushioning of the pot holder did not come out, so I am sewing up my edges. And to do that, I'm just doing a simple whip stitch and just making a knot to start with at the beginning, and then doing that whip stitch all along the edge of the pot holder. And if you wanted to, you could totally use a sewing machine for this, but since these are super small, it maybe took me about 5 minutes to sew up that edge. And once I got to the end, I just added a couple extra stitches around the side of it and then used my needle to tie it off. Now that I have my edges secure, I can actually start working on the actual koozie for the handles, and I'm kind of just going to roll this up like a burrito, and the side that I did the stitching on to start with is going to kind of go underneath the side that I did not stitch. And if you're making these, you're going to want to kind of measure your handle to make sure these are going to fit around them properly before you start sewing. And if you're using a smaller pot holder and not one that was this size, then you can just fold it in half and sew it up. Now, just like before, how I did the edge of these, I am going to be doing that same whip stitch, just going around and over. It's a really simple stitch, even if you've never sewn before. This is a basic stitch. It's easy and everyone can do it. Now, I would not recommend using hot glue for this project. Again, this is going to get very hot and you want this to be nice and secure, and you don't want any glue melting on here. As far as using fabric glue, I am not really sure what the heat rating on fabric glue is. You could always check the back of your bottle, but again, like I said, this is a super easy stitch and it takes very little time to do. You might also notice that I used brown thread for this, and that's because I kind of like the look of thread showing. If you want, you can use the same color thread as your fabric. Now, once I got to the end, then again, just like I did before, I added a couple more stitches to the sides of this before I tied it off. This project is actually going to be a redo of a project I did last year. I made this thermostat cover and it worked great in our space. The only reason I don't still have this particular one is because I accidentally knocked it off the wall and broke it. Now, even though I never had any problems with the airflow to this thermostat, I did have a lot of comments last year that they love the thermostat cover, but that they were worried about the airflow. So for this remake, we are going to make sure that there is plenty of airflow to this. Just like last year, I'm using just a thrift store frame, but instead of the wood pieces from Dollar Tree, I'm actually going to be using 1-inch square dowels for this. I actually purchased these from Amazon and there is a link to these in the description box below. So I'm going to end up cutting these dowels down to fit my frame, and I'm only going to need 3 sides for this. I'm not going to do a bottom piece, but as you can see here, I cut down some of those square dowels and I did cut little center pieces. Basically, I am going to be making side frames and a top frame with these pieces. And I'm just using some wood glue to put these little rectangular frame pieces together. Once the wood glue was dry, then I painted all of my pieces with some black chalk paint. You can paint this any color you want, but I want to do a bronze effect. So I'm doing the black chalk paint first, and then I'm going to go over all of my pieces with some European gold rub and buff. And I know there are only 2 little side pieces in these clips. The top piece is just outside of the frame, but here it is, all 3 pieces together. Now, once all of the paint was dry, you can leave these just as they are and leave that little center piece so that the airflow can get through there just like that. But I decided to use some of this leftover lace curtain that I had from a project in a previous video, and I'm just going to cut down 3 little pieces and I stapled them to the inside part of these wood pieces. Then I used some more wood glue to put the little box frame all together. Now this part is again totally optional, but I also added some little penny nails into the sides of my box frame. And then just to blend those in, I used some more of that European gold rub and buff over those nails. Now I also wanted to dress my frame up a little bit, so I'm using these little metal corner pieces that I got from Amazon and using some gel super glue just to attach those and give the frame a little bit of character. Now to finish this off so that I can open and close the frame against the box, I'm adding some small little hinges to the top of the box, and then I will attach these to the frame. And that's going to be it for today's video. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.